Well, hello everybody and welcome to our Diversity in Islam panel. Welcome to the Hub, lovely to have you here. How exciting is this? Yes, very. Awesome is the answer. We thought we'd run these diversity in ... panels to address some of the themes that you might have approached at the GCSE. We chose the themes of relationships and the sort of loosely entitled one, existence of God, ideas around that. Because we thought this would be a really fantastic opportunity to look at the diversity within the traditions and also to hear these unique individuals also speak from their perspective, which is just a wonderful thing to hear. However, in the last panel, Diversity in Christianity, actually we thought it went off-piste in a way that teachers clearly needed. So I think we'll let this panel go where it needs to go, because ultimately we're here for teachers, for you to ask the questions you need to ask and to, for our speakers to explore the ideas with you. I think we should start by hearing our speakers introduce themselves and maybe give a few words about the tradition they represent. Yes, please. I'm just going to introduce it. I'm going to go and sit down now. Yeah. We're going to run from 12 till 1. Enjoy. Thank you.
Sorry. Hi. I'm Alan Brine. I'm just chairing this panel. So my role is just to kind of field questions from you and help us to move the session along. We have with us 4 eminent speakers on Islam from varying traditions, which is good because in the last session on Christianity we were a bit loaded with Catholics, but here we're going to have plenty of diversity. The idea certainly, as you said, is to look at some of those themes that are going to turn up on GCSE around relationships, families, existence of God, life after death, and look at different perspectives, because one of the things we're interested in is this notion of what are the differences within Islam that we need to reflect in our teaching. But before we do that, in order to kind of get us going, what I've asked each of our speakers to do is to just give us for very few minutes, just a statement, almost a kind of personal statement in a way, about what for them are the really fundamental ideas at the heart of their faith, at the heart of Islam, that they would want pupils to grasp. So, and perhaps as well, what are the things that frequently pupils have serious misconceptions about that we as teachers need to unscramble when it comes to understanding the Muslim faith? So, without further ado, let me start with the list I have in front of me. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves, if that's okay, and the tradition within Islam from which you speak. And we'll start with Maurice. Very good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you.
Few thoughts from you on the kind of key ideas of Islam that, from your perspective.
Assalamu alaikum. Maurice is my European name. Irfan Alahi is my Arabic name, and my surname is Coles. I'm not even going to bore you with my background in too much detail because I'm obviously not a young man, although in Islamic terms I'm but a teenager. So I will do my best not to be too stroppy if you ask me difficult questions. I've been a convert for about 16 years now, so I'm really very, very young. My particular entry point into Islam is related to Sufi tradition. And in particular initially in relation to poetry, like so many other people, and the whole what's called the Ikhsani tradition in terms of art and literature. So that's the background. I run a charity which is now 3 years old, called the Co-Ed Foundation, which is a charity about compassion in education. We're the poorest charity in the world, but we're rich in intellectual and compassionate capital, so we will change the world by the time I'm taken from it. In terms of the key thing, unsurprisingly, and I say this to a lot of Muslim youngsters, the key issue for me and the key point about Islam is the word compassion. Because how many times do we use it? Rahman, it's 113 of the 114 surahs start with that. We use it in constant prayer. And yet, of course, if you talk to lots of Muslims, let alone non-Muslims, compassion doesn't spring to mind as the key driver, the key virtue, the key aspect about the faith. And people look at me and they say, "You don't look like a Muslim." I always get that, and I said, well, I always ask what a Muslim looks like, and then we go on and we get a huge debate about spirituality and spiritual drive, and how God, in my case, Allah, calls you to various paths. So that's the first major thing I think that by the time you finish teaching these pupils, that hopefully they'll realise that Islam is a religion of love and love in action, because it's actually very, very active. It's not just being a soft, woolly love, it's actually love in action, and that should permeate everything. The obverse of that, which needs to be taught, I think, and Waqar and I will be doing a session this afternoon, is the whole notion of jihad. And I did a lot of work in my various incarnations about identity with adults after 7/7. And whenever you ask a question, what's jihad, they say, of course, it's holy war. I mean, straight. And then you've got to explain in much more detail about the greater and lesser. So that's the obverse side. That's to say you've got the compassionate side and the jihad side, and things both need, they're concepts that need to be well developed. Sandwiched in the middle of all that, is actually Islam and citizenship, which I know is not your particular field, but it is one of mine. I ran for 3 years a massive project called the ICE Project, Islam and Citizenship Education, when we actually took all the citizenship values, I don't mean the Govian values, the one before Michael Gove destroyed everything, and we had a sense of balance and honesty and integrity. I mean, no sense political, by the way. And we Islamicized that, and we demonstrated that actually you could not be a good Muslim unless you were a good citizen. So there's all sorts of overlaps there. And also we did 44 lessons, which you can download on the ICE Project free. So that's me.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Zameer.
Hello.
Welcome.
I'm Zameer Hussain. I'm head of RE at Beale High School. I'm from the Shia tradition. Sorry if I repeat something things I just said in my session just now. So we are a minority group in Muslims. We're about 15% of the world population of Muslims. And it's always hard living in a minority. I was born and brought up in this country. But when I went to school and stuff, I said it in my session, I got bullied for being a Shia Muslim by my fellow Muslim people in my school. So I've always been on the defensive all the time. It's a great honor for me to be here and talk about what we truly, truly believe in. In terms of what's very important to Shia Islam, there's a few things come to mind. I didn't prepare this, I thought I'd do it top of my head. There's one statement by the first Shia Imam, Ali, and that's my mantra, and I think it should be on the front of every mosque of this country, of the world. A person is either your brother in faith or equal in humanity. That's the way I live my life, kind of in agreement with what Maurice just said. Because Islam is about citizenship and compassion, and it's about the community, and it's about human rights. And one of the biggest champions of rights was the first Shia Imam, Ali, who's known for that. Even the UN secretary at the time, Kofi Annan, said this statement that he made is something that governments should look at. So Shia Islam is all about justice. It's about, not taking oppression, basically. It's about standing up for human rights. And that's why the 12 Shia Imams that we believe in, they all, apart from the 12th awaited Messiah, they all died because they stood up for human rights. And that's a big thing for me. And the second thing I'd say is about leaving a legacy. And again, in the Shia tradition, we have a huge emphasis of remembering our forefathers, especially those who gave to society. And because they left a legacy, some of the Imams of the later Imams were 23, 24 years old, but they left a pure legacy of human rights. So even me personally, I want to leave this world where I'm not just another gravestone. I'm someone who's left a mark on this world in a positive way. And that comes from Shia teachings and Islamic teachings in general, to be fair. But in the Shia tradition, the 12 Imams that I follow definitely taught that. But that's what I would look at. It's all about human rights, and it's all about living together, with differences, there's no doubt about it, but there's no need to kill each other. That's my mantra anyway.
Thank you. Wahida.
Hi, sorry, I
Welcome.
just cut you off there. I'm Wahida Begum. I'm an RE teacher at Woodbridge High School in Redbridge. I just noticed I'm the only woman on this panel. So I guess the ideas that I think are core to Islam or whatever, I do share with both Zameer and Maurice the whole idea of compassion. I think that's a key concept in Islam, and it links to what I think is also really important, equality. I think, one of the things that the Prophet taught was you treat everybody with respect and dignity, regardless of whether or not you agree with them or whether you share the same views. And I think for me, as a Muslim woman, equality is a major issue. I mean, one of the things that you said to talk about was, what do students ask? I always get questions about, I get questions from students or staff members or random people in the street who think that it's totally okay to come up to me and ask me questions on my headscarf. And I think yesterday I had a Year 9 student say, "But you're forced to wear that, aren't you, miss?" And he was saying that on the basis of he'd seen what one of the London mayor electoral candidates had said, Sadiq Khan, something about we need to look into the homes of those people who choose to wear the niqab or jilbab. So for me, as a Muslim woman, I find that concept of equality key. That's it, really, I guess.
Thank you. And finally, Waqar, good to be here.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you.
Likewise, thank you, Alan, for the introduction. I'll start by saying Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings of God be upon all of you. My name is Waqar Ahmedi. I'm head of religious education at King's Norton Girls' School in Birmingham. Hence my lateness this morning, I do apologise. Transport links weren't the greatest, so I had to walk from Moorgate Station, which I've had about better walks in my life, but there you go. In terms of why I'm on the panel, some of you may be surprised that I myself was slightly shocked that I was even invited to be on the panel, because of my affiliation to a group of Muslims called the Ahmadiyya, which you may have heard about in the news more recently in light of the killing of the Glasgow shopkeeper Asad Shah, which has raised questions about the status of the Ahmadiyya community within Islam. But that's who I'm representing, and I'm grateful to the organisers for including me on the panel there. And because of my affiliation to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, our motto is love for all, hatred for none. I think that is underpinned by the two key cornerstones within Islam. The first is called Huququllah, which means the rights due to God, and the second is known as Huquq al-Ibad, which translates as rights towards humanity. And I don't believe that they're independent of each other. In the first instance, we are referring to the nature of God, God being the maker and the creator of all, who sent all the various prophets throughout history, culminating with the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, who brought the final message, which is the Holy Quran. But along with that is the link with humanity as a whole, our role as human beings, as stewards of the earth, and what is expected of us. And I believe that the two go hand in hand. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, said that one who is not grateful to people cannot be grateful to God. And I think that if more Muslims themselves actually demonstrated that, we'll have a much more peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a very good introduction.
May I make a comment?
Yes.
I mean, here you are surrounded by four of the most loving people that you can possibly...
Absolutely.
I do wonder if you had other groups here, whether you get that same compassionate overview, actually.
Well, clearly, I mean, an obvious question to ask is, I mean, you've all played great deal of emphasis upon compassion and love and community and citizenship, and I'm guessing many of our pupils would wonder whether that's reflective of the message they're receiving. What sense are you making then of the individual? What interpretation do you give to what is clearly a problem, which is that diversity within Islam is clearly expressed in terms of conflict in many situations. The response to the Ahmadiyya movement, and so on and so forth. What sense are you making of that for us?
Personally, I find it very confusing. Confusing but not surprising. I said this in my session earlier. I think the history of Islam, when you look at it and study it in depth, it's not very nice history sometimes. So stuff I see going on in the world, I'm not surprised. Now, Islam, the Quran itself, the whole mantra of the Quran is history repeats itself. Otherwise, why would it tell you stories of the past? Human beings the nature of humans is always the same. So when God's telling you a story about a certain group of people doing this, doing good or doing bad, it means it's going to happen again in the future, because humankind, I don't believe the nature of them change anyway. So in terms of me, again, I'll speak as a Shia Muslim. Those who know maybe the politics of what's going on in Iraq right now, the number one target of these group of thugs is the Shia Muslims. Just last month, they gave their monthly magazine. The front of it is why Shia should be killed. Okay, that was the whole magazine. I've read it, and it was disturbing. But at the same time, that's happened in our history. And when I talked about in my first little portion about standing up for justice, as maybe a victim of unjust power sometimes that maybe my people have had, I feel compassion for people going through the same thing. And that's why human rights is all about, I believe, in the Shia tradition and in the Muslim tradition, is about, it doesn't matter whether we're different or not. You're a human before your religion, I think. So I find it very confusing what's going on in the world. And when I think about them being called Muslims, because I know one of the things we're going to talk about is what is it, I think Alan Brine brought it up on social media, what makes you the religion? What are the, who puts the mark there? Who owns Islam? Well, let's look at what makes a human first. I don't identify with those thugs as humans. I have more in common with a zebra than those people, because they're people who have been starved of humanity. It's an absolute cold heart that you see sometimes. And then the victims are two, the Shia Muslims and the Christians. The third victim is Daesh. Yes, I don't like naming them, but yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And again, I think media has a big part to play in it. When 10,000 people every year go to Marble Arch, me included, to do a demonstration to commemorate an event, a religious event that's anti-terrorism, does not get one newspaper article in the media. But when a couple of people who dress as pirates with placards do a little demonstration, it's all over the media. I think media has a big part to play in it, I think.
Other thoughts on this? It's obviously an issue that's rises to the heart of many people's questions. What sense are we making of the conflict within Islam at the moment?
I think if I've done a lot of work in madrasas over, and that was where the ICE project was, which was a Labour government finance thing over 3 years, and I think there are massive issues still about the teaching of Islam in particular. And one of the key points that we tried to do within the ICE project was to say it's all about context. And that what we've still got in many madrasas is it's not quite rote learning, but I mean, let me give you a personal example. My little rundown mosque in Leicester from my own sheikh, I call them the Sufi boys. There's a couple of lads there, and I was asking them about tafsir, which is Quranic exegesis, and I said which is really they should be taught about looking at the Quran and then deciding. So you need to ask a number of fundamental questions about when the thing was revealed, why was it revealed, what the context was. And these young lads who are university, they're about 25 now, and they said, no, we've never done that. We've never actually looked at the Quran and began to, if you like, deconstruct it. And I said, what about at home? And he said, well, yeah, my parents have got a book, one of them said. So I said, what book? He said, I haven't got any idea. And I think that's at the heart of many of the problems, really. If you are, and I think if you're emotionally attracted to ISIS or whatever you call it, or to social justice, then unless you've got that intellectual understanding, that knowledge, that ilm, I think it's very, very hard for young people to actually come to terms with all that. So consequently, if somebody says, well, I hate Shias because look what they've done, etc., etc., then unless you are able to say, well, hang on a second, this is the advantage of being a revert, is that I can say things which sometimes other Muslims wouldn't say. I mean, I say, well, okay, can you show me in the Quran where are you getting this from? And that's what's lacking, I think, really. And that's a major problem, because until we get our young Muslims to be able to enter that debate, I think it's because obviously there are big emotional reasons why you'd want to leave, and all what's happening in the Islamic world, and indeed in our world here and now, and you need to have an arsenal of understanding in order to actually respond. But my final point is that, and I love doing this with young people, who say, well, what religion is God? I leave that with you. Alan will answer.
I just wanted to say, I do a youth group with Muslim girls and boys over the summer holiday, and what Maurice said is more or less what I always find with those kids is lack of education, is lack of actually understanding what their religion actually teaches. So I personally feel that these conflicts, this whole I hate a person because they're Shia or Ahmedi or whatever, you have to go back to the example of the Prophet. As Muslims, I think all of us are in agreement. You look to the example of the Prophet. How did he behave? What did he do? How did he interact with other people to determine how we should behave? And when I speak to the students, they don't understand a lot of the story of the Prophet. They know that, there's this guy called Muhammad, came along, he had revelations, he went to Medina, then conquered Mecca, and Islam spread. But they don't actually know about him as a person. And I feel that when you understand who he was as a person, how he interacted. So, for example, when I told the students about the hadith of where there was the funeral of a Jewish man and he was passing by, and he stood up in respect, to show respect to the fact that this person had died, and the companions had asked him, why are you standing up? And he said, it's a person who died. You're showing respect. It's basic, like Zameer was saying, basic humanity, acknowledging that, okay, fine, that person doesn't share the same views as me, but they're still human. And even if you go back to the Sharia, one of the core principles of the Sharia is preservation of life. It doesn't say preservation of just Muslim lives, it's life in general. And I think it's the lack of education, it's the fact that when you talk to a lot of young Muslims, they get their knowledge from Google, Sheikh Google and YouTube. And one thing I found when I was in the same school as Deborah was that the girls, if somebody was able to quote a Quranic verse, these girls don't know. They've not actually read an English translation of the Quran. They've not sat down and studied.
Are you questioning are you Are you raising questions then about the quality of the education that the children are receiving within the mosque setting itself? Because clearly the schools can't. It's the mosque setting that's crucial here, is it?
I've seen it in practice with some mosques where they do amazing work with the kids, where they teach them from a young age, this is what Islam is. But from my own personal experience, my going to the mosque was me sitting there and somebody teaching me how to recite the letters, how to pronounce the letters. Nobody sat me down and said, this is what Islam is, this is what the Prophet would have done. It was only as I grew older and I started to seek it myself that I learned. And a lot of the students aren't going to do that. They don't get that at home. Their parents assume you're Muslim, you just know. That's it. So if you've left them to their own devices and they turn to something like YouTube and somebody sounds like they know what they're talking about, they'll go, oh, in the Quran, a verse this and that, it says this. You sound knowledgeable. As a 15-year-old, I'd take that. So.
I'm guessing that possibly within the Ahmadiyya community that the quality of understanding may be more refined. Is it the case that for young people within that community that actually learning about your tradition is more sophisticated? Now,
you can't claim it's more sophisticated. We certainly try our best. That's all you can do. That is our jihad of this age. But we do have a program of activities of trying to instill a spirit of loyalty to both faith and country within our tradition. And I remember growing up as a young boy when I used to go to the mosque, and now my kids are in that position. We would go to our mosque and every single meeting would start with a pledge. And in that pledge, the words that we'd recite are that I will be ready to sacrifice my life, time, wealth and property for the sake of my faith, but also my country and nation. So the whole concept of being British and Muslim comes naturally to us. We don't see there being any conflict between being a citizen of a Western country and following the Quran and the Hadith. There's absolutely no conflict for us whatsoever. I think it's ironic that we're facing this situation today and observing the state of Islam right now, considering that the name Islam derives from a word that means peace. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu his peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, is described in the Quran as a rahmatul alameen, which translates as a mercy for mankind. Not a mercy for Muslims only, he's a mercy to the whole of humanity. And it's quite interesting that he himself saw the decline of Islam in his own time, and he actually prophesied a time when Muslims would become the way they are today. There's many traditions that I can share with you if you're interested, referring to people like ISIS today. He actually foretold a time when there'll be a group like ISIS, but he also foretold a time, the Prophet Muhammad did. Yeah, in the Hadith there are many traditions where he's referred to people who would pose as Muslims and yet commit such acts that are horrific. But he also foretold a time when Islam would revive again. And that's where we believe our particular tradition comes in, the Ahmadiyya community, founded in the late 19th century. So that's where we come at it from. But it's very important that we instill within our youth, and I think we demonstrate that clearly. Today, I was in a jihad actually, whether to come to this particular conference or to go to Hyde Park, where there is a charity challenge being organised by our community, which is raising money for British causes, for the British Legion, for Macmillan Cancer Support, for various British charities, Save the Children, Great Ormond Street Hospital. This is part of our tradition, so we are instilling within our youth that whole spirit of being loyal and committed, and also to serve your country as well as your faith.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Right, I want to open it up now. I mean, you're facing the issue of teaching, probably for many of you, the GCSE that's coming up, the themes that are there within it. Do you now want to offer questions to our panel about aspects of that perhaps you'd like to explore? Kate, you're going to ask one. Go on, through it.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much. What an amazingly diverse, fascinating panel. And thank you, Waqar, for coming here and not going to the
Pleasure.
so much.
He's going to charge.
We're so happy to have you.
That's right. We have the fees attractive enough, but kidding.
So you've all really enlightened on education in various forms, talking about education within Islamic communities, and obviously we're here as educationalists. It's a funny situation, isn't it? A religion is being taught largely by people that are not, connected. Islam is British Islam, we know about it, we know stuff, we've read a few books, we have friends that are Muslims. Most RE teachers are not from a Muslim background, and it's not the same as RE teachers who are not Christian, but they might nominally or belong to the culture. So, I really like the work of Waqar Hussain up in Oxford, who said to me before that Islam itself is a reaction to a set of problems. It itself is a revolutionary movement. It was a solution, and I feel myself observing British Islam and global Islam as a complete supporter and friend, but not someone from inside the tradition. I feel like it's time for you to have another revolution, to have another movement, a step forward, a solution. But I wonder if we as RE teachers who are not Muslim can help by teaching the stuff around the edges, not necessarily from within Islam, not the focus anymore. How about we teach them history? How about we teach them context? How about we teach about colonialism, the expansion from the West into all the Muslim majority countries in the 1900s? How about we teach about Islamophobia itself, where it comes from, which is basically Christianity, and not looking at Muslims and if that's going to help us be less Islamophobic. I wonder how we can support global Islam and British Islam to take a step forward.
I'll answer that. I think because in our school, our Year 7 scheme of work is actually historical, and I totally agree. I think the history of Islam is so important. It's absolutely fundamental.
Can we have that?
I think history. The problem is, in the Muslim community, what I've observed, there's not much focus on history as such. I can say from our tradition, we are very critical of history. And that's why we kind of get criticised, because it's like, come on, leave the past now, let's move forward. In the Shia tradition, it's all about going back to history and looking at what happened. And as I said before, you learn from the past. I think to look at the context of Islam, how it came, and obviously what happened afterwards and how it got it to where it is today, I think is absolutely important. We link in our scheme of work in Year 7, it's by our locally agreed syllabus, our old one. It's about, we bring the theology in, but along with the history. When Prophet Muhammad was born, what was it like? We do what pre-Islamic Arabia was like. So they know the context and the change, and we ask, was it a good change or a bad change? Ashley does an activity where he gets guys, the kids to imagine they're a pre-Islamic or Arab. Why would you not like the Prophet? and be critical about it. Muslim kids are doing it. So I think it's absolutely important to look at the history. I think it's so fundamental. And my personal interest in Islam has always been history. I find it fascinating that when I got into religion, when I was about, I've always been a practicing Muslim. When I was 18 to 21 at university, what got me into religion was history. I was like, Shia Sunni split, this is fascinating. Why did this happen? Over this one little thing, it's dominated to a big avalanche. Why did it happen? So I absolutely agree. I think history has to be taught in within an Islamic context. And we could do it in a way where I've seen the Abrahamic faiths get taught. From Judaism to Christianity, then to Islam. I think that's a wonderful way to teach it. And we're looking at doing that in our school from next year.
Fantastic.
Any other thoughts on it?
Yeah. I think it's very difficult. Because as the most contentious thing that we've got, and obviously with the refugee crisis now and so on and so forth, it becomes harder and harder, doesn't it, really? Because you touch upon issues in RE which are going to be very raw. And I think it's absolutely right in relation to the historic side of things and the actual content, but as equally important to me is how you come at the whole thing and how you transmit your values to your pupils. And I would say if you come with an open heart, and without, you wouldn't be blindly prejudiced anyway, and it's quite hard often because there's a lot of forces that are going to be attacking you. I mean, not literally, but metaphorically. And I think if you can inculcate within your, if that's the right word, within your students, an openness towards these things, because when you consider the input that they're going to get from the media and point about the media and not being there for you guys when you're doing something quite positive. I mean, how often do you get positive Muslim stories in the press? It's absolutely dominated by the negative. And I think it's partly our role as teachers to try and get a sense of balance in all that and then say, well, because people often ask me, and I say, well, actually, my sheikh says this, I mean, that I come at things with my heart, and I think if we can get young people to do that, and obviously with a degree of compassion, then a lot of the problems actually won't exist.
I'm going to take a couple of questions. So there's 1, 2, 3.
I'm just thinking of the idea of history, and I'm sure you'll pick up later in the jihad session a bit more. But how do you link for the students the idea of Islam as a religion of peace with the historical concept that Muhammad was no pacifist as such, being frank with them about that?
I think, I don't use the whole Islam's religion of peace thing. We do believe in war. It's there. Most Muslims do believe in the concept of jihad. Yes, the greater jihad is the jihad of the self, but there is the lesser jihad, and it took place. There's no doubt about it. But again, you got to look at why you would do that. I find it quite fascinating that we live in an era where many people are pacifist. War is the last thing. But every year we do Memorial Day. Wear the poppies. People, they fought wars. When you talk about Islam and war, it's terrorists, jihad. No, we can't do that. Wars did take place in Islam. Some of them were unjust. Some of them were horrific, in my opinion. I'm ashamed that some of the things Muslims did in the past and today. But again, teaching it, I'm sure you all great RE teachers know, it is a last resort. And secondly, it's a response. You never make the first move. It's always a response. Prophet Muhammad's, all of his wars were responses to oppression. Yes.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, sorry.
Let's take 3 questions and then.
Cool.
Okay, so I come from a totally separate Muslim background, and so I am probably very, very liberal in the sense, and actually I quite enjoy it because I take all the compassion, all the love, and I almost have all the glory of Islam because I'm really not biased in any of these opinions coming from the board. And when I teach that to my boys from that position, and they'll say something about Islam, and I say, well, I'm a Muslim, and they go, what? And they're completely shocked by it. And I think that it's really important that when we do teach the resources that we use, we really try to show unbiased opinions and unbiased Muslims, because we do exist. There are so many of us in this country, in this world, and I think we tend to focus really, really on the negatives, and we need to try and introduce that positive stuff. But how do we do that if all we have to go on at the moment is such negativity?
I think we're largely driven by the curriculum, that which is part of the problem sometimes in terms of how restrictive it can be. Now, obviously, with the GCSE specs, and I presume that most that are sitting here will be doing Islam, there's obviously an explicit reference to Sunni and Shia beliefs. but I think there's a need to recognise that within those traditions there is so much diversity and so many different sub-denominations, so many different strands of groups and branches and types of understanding that it's difficult to keep count. So I know there's a big discussion at the moment about the Deobandi movement, which is one of the key denominations within Sunni Islam, if I can say. But I think as long as you're sticking to the core principles, which most, if not all, Muslims are agreed upon, so the 5 pillars, for example, the 6 articles of faith, which pretty much all Muslims do accept. I know that within the Shia tradition you've got the 10 obligatory acts in addition to that. But in principle, no Muslim would have a problem accepting those either. So I think we have to just make sure that we're realistic in terms of how much we can cover. But as I said, part of the problem is being driven by the curriculum, and just in terms of how much curriculum time we have, that's another issue that we face, obviously. So I think just keep things realistic as possible.
Just one point in combating this negative image of Islam and jihad. You mentioned earlier about fundraising for the English Legion. There are lots of good photo streams and images on the internet now of soldiers who are Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, who fought for empire forces in the 2 wars, which you can use as images to sort of cut through this kind of them and us.
Absolutely.
Together.
Yes, I think there were 400,000 Muslims that fought for the British Army in the First World War, which I didn't know until very recently. So we're learning new and new things all the time, aren't we? But I think it's right to emphasise that it's not just a Muslim thing, that all faith communities have got that very positive sort of sense of loyalty to where they live. And obviously Islam is no exception to that. If I'm able just to come back to a point that you raised a moment ago about pacifism and Islam. One thing I would say on that front is that the Prophet Muhammad was a pacifist for the first 13 years of his prophethood. Before he fled to Medina because of the persecution and the oppression he was facing, during those first 13 years he was a pacifist. He didn't want to retaliate. It was a principle of forgiveness. And when he moved to Medina, and I was going to go through this in the jihad session, but later, do forgive me for bringing this in now. But we know that that military action was needed, because even whilst he fled to Medina, he was even being pursued by the enemies of Islam despite the migration. And we believe that because Muhammad is called the Khatamun Nabiyyin, the seed of the prophets, he had to demonstrate in his person all the qualities that previous prophets had showed. So all the prophets that stood for compassion, mercy, and turning the other cheek, as well as a prophet who stood for justice. So depending on which part of the prophet's life you're looking at, I think it's probably inaccurate to say that the prophet was never a pacifist.
I was just going to say about the pacifist comment, I think the way I see Islam is it's a very practical religion. It takes into consideration that there will be times when, you're being attacked. What do you do? If the Prophet hadn't engaged in that, as Muslims, we would be stuck on how we respond in these situations. So he's the greatest example to mankind for us. So he's supposed to epitomise, like Waqar said, everything that on how a Muslim should behave. That's why he's got both elements. But you do take into consideration that he did spend the first 13 or so years not retaliating. It was only when he was in Medina and he was still being attacked that, as an act of self-defense, he did it. It's not ever supposed to be you start it. It's always supposed to be as a reaction to something.
Yeah, I just want to draw, I think, a few threads together. First of all, I think, Waqar, you were just saying that, of course, even within all these subgroups, there are so many different shades of opinion. And you also referred to the fact that we're limited by the constraints of specifications and what we have to do. I think we're also limited by the fact that we are trying, by virtue of being here and trying to digest everything that you're saying, from an adult viewpoint. And in my experience, traditionally teenagers don't have those shades of grey. They see things in a much more absolute way. And so I'm wondering, and also drawing attention to what you were saying earlier about Daesh and so on. And the whole issue, I think, of saying, well, they're not Muslims, yes, they are Muslims. is it, and being so key in the newspapers, whether you know, obviously negatively, but that is what these kids are seeing. So is that viewpoint, and bearing in mind the kids are black and white, is it a viewpoint that you think, whether we like it or not, whether you like it or not, or whether you agree with it or not, is it a valid viewpoint in terms of teaching material when kids have got these long, is it now, I don't know what they are, 12 mark, 15 mark, whatever they, you know, evaluations, seeing things from different points of view. Is Daesh a valid viewpoint, seeing as it is an absolute and it is what the kids are, sadly, are receiving? So what do you do about that?
That's one of the questions I'm going to raise in the jihad session this afternoon.
Which I won't be.
Which you won't be part of. Okay. Very briefly then, the point I was going to raise in the afternoon session was that obviously ISIS claims to be Muslim, and as a member of a community that is themselves declared non-Muslims by many people, I can't declare anybody else as a non-Muslim. If somebody claims to be a Muslim, they believe in the oneness of God, they believe in the 5 pillars, they believe in all the prophets, they believe in all the divinely revealed scriptures, I can't say to them they're not a Muslim. Okay, that is a claim they've made, and that's between them and God. I can't interfere and I can't pass judgment on somebody. But the focus of the session this afternoon, what I was going to go through, was looking at the rules of lesser jihad and looking at the context of the wars that the Prophet taught, and then applying that to the modern context in terms of what ISIS does, and then let the kids judge for themselves how Islamic is ISIS. Are they really following the example of the Prophet, or are they not? So I think that's one way around it.
I would just like to add to that I agree with Waqar that, you know, the personal faith, like dismissing, saying that they're not Muslim, that's something that I think a lot of Muslims would hesitate in saying, because that is something that's personal between them and God. But you look at, okay, how Islamic is their behaviour? Does it fit in with the way in which the Prophet conducted himself, the way in which the Quran says you should, and the guidelines of lesser jihad? That's where I think it comes into.
Where would the Deobandis fit within this? There's been a lot of attention to the Deobandis in the last couple of weeks. BBC running some pieces on it. Now they're not out there with Daesh, but they're also problematic.
Problematic in what sense?
In the sense that,
just clarify for me.
Where do they stand within the panoply of Muslim diversity as a group?
I think the Bandis make up the majority of Muslims, I think, in Britain, in terms of their affiliation to a particular school of thought within Sunni Islam. So, and I suspect that being so huge, they will have issues and challenges, as any faith community does whenever they grow. The same applies to previous faiths and religions, and Christianity, Judaism. There are many manifestations of those, and obviously Islam is no exception either.
Kind of back to your question, because I want to say something about that. From my point, is that ideology legitimate? Do they have say? I think, from my point of view, as I said, I don't think this group are new. If you look at Islamic history, the first...
Daesh,
yeah. In Islamic history, there's a group called the Khawarij, which you study Islamic history. They used to have, dressed like they do, they used to have the best voices of the Quran, and we see them, these people, they pray, they fast, they do all that kind of thing. But when it came to compassion, it was gone. That was the first group of people similar to ISIS. The second group is the one who killed the Prophet's grandson in Karbala, which I talked about in my session. Now, look at it this way. You've got a group of so-called Muslims beheading the grandson of Prophet Muhammad 50 years after his death, who themselves saw Prophet Muhammad show him compassion. The boy Prophet Muhammad raised in his own house. Now, 50 years later, this same group of people who witnessed that are now murdering his grandson, his family, and taking his wife, his children, and all the women and children captive. From my point of view, this is nothing new. And in fact, I'd say they're worse, those ones in history. Where did that ideology come from? That is the question. Religiously, I don't know where it comes from. I honestly, when I see the religious justification, it comes from a lack of education. That's what it is. And the problem is, I go back to the question of madrasa. I think, unfortunately, there is a kind of, I'm telling you what to say, I'm telling you what to believe, you believe it. And it's quite interesting because I watched a documentary recently on how to become, if you want to become a Shia scholar, how does it work there? When you go to the seminary in Iraq or in Iran, once you've had a lecture, you are commanded for 1 hour to question your lecturer. You have to do it and try and disprove him. That's the kind of Islam that I believe in. How many times one of the most common words in the Quran is think or ponder, contemplate. Was one of the most common words in the Quran. But unfortunately, because of certain agendas and because of, I think, of fear of hearing the other point of view, it's no, you listen to what I say. I think that's a big problem. So I think this ideology stems from ignorance, first of all, but it's come in the past before, no doubt about it.
Not really a question but a comment, but this idea of diversity and how wide does the net go? My students have been really interested when I talk to them about something called the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, who are very open for like LGBT issues, feminist issues, environmental issues, create all different ways, all different types. The idea is that anyone who possibly considers himself Muslim or interested in it could go and feel welcome. And so my students are really fascinated by that as another aspect of diversity. Most of my students are Muslim. I'm like tentative at first when I talk to them, but actually they're really interested and they really want to get to know what the diverse elements are. And for them it adds a certain thing. And I feel like sending their work to the Daily Mail and saying, look, can you publish this paragraph that they've just written? Because I'm thinking,
that's high risk.
So it's more of a comment than a question, sorry.
It's quite a challenge for us as teachers. I mean, isn't it? That on the one hand, we do want to counter a deluge of media misrepresentation, as one might describe it, and that's so we always have a social purpose in terms of trying to achieve that sort of balance. On the other hand, we want to engage with an objective study of a religion, which includes the Wahhabi tradition, the Saudi Arabian. I mean, it's not just Daesh that potentially is problematic. How do we balance that? The issue about genuinely, objectively looking at diversity, and on the other hand, countering the deluge of negativity that the pupils are encountering. Any thoughts on how we balance those two perspectives?
I think one of the things that I don't know whether it's in necessarily RE, but in the general schooling, is to get a much more objective view of the nature of the press. Because I mean, my whole background is in race and faith equality, and I used to. I mean, she's dead now, God bless her. But I used to cite my mother, who was a reader of the Daily Mail, right? Because I come from.
Forgive her.
Well, I mean, I think she's still in heaven now, actually, but God's forgiven her for reading me Daily Mail for so long. But her views reflected, and she was in no sense was she a racist at all. She was actually a South London girl. She was actually very sweet, my mother, and very loving. But sometimes she say things and I go, what did you say there, Mum? And we would then have a debate, and a very interesting debate, about why it was that certain newspapers, I read The Guardian, and my worldview is very, very much influenced by The Guardian. If I read the Daily Mail, it's very different. And with young people, and it's understandable, that if they read papers at all, or whatever they get from the, it's actually that, it's there, it's like gospel, isn't it, really? And it is beginning to develop that sense of critical awareness. And you've made a very key point about, in Islam we're supposed to rethink, we're supposed to reflect. I can't recall how many times it actually says that. And it's beginning to give young people the opportunity, and I don't know, I mean, I could construct a lesson on this, but in terms of looking at some of the diversity and then saying, well, okay, what is the truth in all this? But it's actually beginning to get them to challenge some of these issues, isn't it? Because if you just take what you see from the media as the truth, then and that's what happens. It happens with most people. Yeah, and now although I'm based in Birmingham, I'm still a London boy really, and I listen to Sadiq Khan and Goldsmith's using the negativity the Islam card, and I'm thinking, my golly, and saying to community that I happen to be married into, which is the Gujarati Hindu community, that actually if Sadiq comes, they're going to take all your wealth away, and you think this is gutter politics. I mean, real gutter politics, and all it does is add to the prejudices, doesn't it? Really, And I think it's incumbent upon us to try and help young people. And we used to have at one, in better curriculum times, some media studies, didn't we? Which were just they were designed to actually get people to interrogate and say, well, and that's one of the key things with all the stuff that we do. It's like, and is there a truth in all this?
Some of the difficulty is that we all face, especially when it's so prominent in the news, especially in through the media, is the danger is teaching Islam as a news item, as opposed to teaching it as a faith. And I think we need to stick to the actual tenets, not sacrifice those at the expense of just simply focusing on a certain aspect of Islam simply because the kids are hearing about it in the news. But I think there's another space to do that as well, in terms of in the citizenship context, the promotion of British values. I think we are well placed as RE teachers to deliver on that, but we're not solely placed to do that. It's a whole school commitment. So I think there will be a space to do that in assemblies and PSHE lessons as well.
Yeah.
Just I'll take one or two people we haven't heard from before.
Yeah. One question I have is that it seems like our panel very much, considering it's called Diversity in Islam, very much agree on most things and kind of about compassion and what Islam's about. What do you think there are kind of fundamental issues which you disagree on, and would you like to kind of explore them, together as a panel in a safe environment? Because we've been very much.
Yeah. I look down on him.
Where's are the fundamental aspects where you disagree?
But Abson, so you should, sister. So you should.
I think.
Go. Sorry.
Would the areas where you disagree be largely theological or social?
Theological, but because of authority. It all comes down to authority.
Right.
Okay? Where do I get my religion from? Now, two common things we have is Quran and Prophet Muhammad. All four of us here want to follow two entities. Yes. The Quran and Prophet Muhammad. How do I get to them? That's the difference. I get to them through the family of Prophet Muhammad and the 12 Imams. My colleagues, they will get them through the companions, the caliphs, okay? The generations afterwards, okay? And because of that one difference, that's created a big domino of effects. And therefore, the way we pray, maybe the way we fast, although minutely, may differ. But again, where do I get my religion from? My understanding of God, although we call him the same God, I might have a different understanding of the way I view God. Because again, my key number one source is different. And that is, my source is the family of the Prophet Muhammad.
Would the others agree? So would the others agree that the fundamental difference is a difference about authority? That's what you're saying. So
I would say so.
Is the key.
Yeah, there is a particular verse of the Quran that says there are three authorities that all Muslims are obliged to obey. The first is Allah as the creator, the second is the Prophet Muhammad, and the third is those in authority amongst you. And that's where Muslims would disagree in terms of which authority they would affiliate themselves to. With the Shia Muslims, for example, it would be the 12 Imams. With the Ahmadiyya community, it will be the caliphs at the moment, as we call them, of the founder of our community, who we believe was the rejuvenator of Islam for the latter days, named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian.
This is 19th century?
That's correct. But after his death, he left a line of caliphs who we see as purely as spiritual leaders. They do not have any political interest. They are apolitical. We believe in the separation of mosque and state. And we believe in that principle of being obedient to him in spiritual matters, but also being loyal to your country in legislative affairs.
Is that a second area in which you disagree? And that's the relationship between religion and state?
We believe in the separation of mosque and state. We don't believe in a theocratic
that's very
system.
strong.
Yes,
that's right. Hence you're accommodationist. You're able to live happily.
Absolutely. As long as religious freedoms are being given, we know that with the Prophet himself, that he was both a head of state as well as head of the faith, but that was because of the context he was living in, and he was unanimously accepted as the leader of Arabia. And we believe that was also wisdom on the part of God, because Muslims also had to see an example of somebody who, whilst he was head of state, how would he act, and how would he conduct affairs, and how would he ensure justice is done. So that's the reason he had to serve both positions. But we believe in the current age that religion and politics are separate.
Yep.
It's interesting because I would agree with that, because I'm taught it's okay to live in a state that's not religious. And in fact, I think the sixth Imam of the Shias was once asked, "Do you think I should move away to a non-Muslim society, or should I live here?" And he asked him, "Can you practice your religion freely in the non-Muslim society? Can you talk about the Imams freely?" He said, "Yes, I can." He goes, "Go there then. Of course you can go there." Prophet Yusuf in the Quran, Joseph, he worked for a polytheist government. He was their treasurer. And then I find it hilarious that placards here do not work for the British government. They're polytheists. You got an arch prophet of the Quran, one of the great prophets of the Quran, working in a government that worshipped idols and committed polytheism in an Islamic context. So this idea of working in a religious, non-religious state is no problem as long as I can practice my religion freely. That's fine. And actually, I'll say one thing: I'd rather live here than certain Muslim countries for sure.
Question. And I feel really responsible as the Sunni person on the board. Sorry, the question, repeat it again, because I was taking in what they were saying.
Well, I mean, just picking up on the notion that is the key thing that divides you, if I can use that phrase.
Theological or social.
Theological or social, or is it, and particularly, would you see it as fundamentally about authority?
I mean, to answer that question, it is definitely about authority. Where I get my sources from, where I go to for advice, differs from both of them. So for me as a Sunni Muslim, there's the Quran, there's the Hadiths, and then I follow a particular law school. There's 4 law schools that are considered to be valid in the decisions that they come to. I follow one particular one. That's where I go to on guidance on how, what breaks my prayer. Is it, so for example, if I'm bleeding, does that break my wudu, the ablutions that I do prior to praying? Does that mean I have to redo it? So in that sense, we differ. In terms of the whole notion of British, allegiance to the state, those guys with the placards, I don't agree with them. I think that's really ridiculous. You're living in the state, and from what I've been taught by my sheikha and my teachers, is that in the past you had this distinction between the land of Islam and the land of non-belief, I guess you want to call it. This was like when you had an Islamic state and whatnot, but that no longer exists. You do not have anything. I would be really hard pressed to say that there is any country that calls itself Muslim that is actually Islamic in the true sense. I think you're really hard pressed to find that. And I think from what I've been taught is that as long as the law of the land does not tell you to do anything that goes against your religion, then you follow the law of the land.
I think it was a scholar by the name of Muhammad Abdur who said that I went to the West
Paris.
And I saw more Muslims. Sorry, I saw more Islam than Muslims, and he went to the East and said I saw more Muslims than Islam. In terms of the values that are promoted, I think that we have more in common here in Britain with Islam than we do, ironically, in so-called Islamic states.
Interesting. Thank you very, very much indeed. Really interesting discussion. Really grateful to you for both talking about your own perspective, but also in a sense reflecting upon it as well, which has been really helpful, I think. Thank you very much indeed. I think lunch called.